All right, let's dive in. We're about to break down the most destructive war in the history of the world, World War II. We're going to look at how it all started, the major turning points, and maybe most importantly, the massive impact it still has on our world today.
To really wrap your head around this, just think about these words for a second. This wasn't just a few countries fighting. We're talking about a conflict that pulled in over 60 nations, completely redrew the borders of the world, and basically set the stage for the rest of the 20th century.
And this number, 70 million. It's almost impossible to really picture. But that's the estimated human cost. It stands as the single deadliest conflict we've ever recorded. Just staggering.
So it really makes you wonder, right? How could a catastrophe this huge even happen? What were the dominoes that had to fall to set the whole world on fire? Well, let's get into it.
Okay, so our story begins with what we're calling the spark. This is the moment the fuse was lit, splitting the world into two fiercely opposing sides. The direct trigger, the event that kicked everything off, was when Hitler's Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. Britain and France had a pact with Poland, so they had no choice. They declared war on Germany. And just like that, World War II in Europe had begun. By 1940, it was already spreading like wildfire. And almost immediately, the world fractured into two huge military teams. You had the Axis powers, mainly Germany, Italy, and Japan, and facing them were the Allied powers, which started with Britain and France, but would eventually grow to include giants like the Soviet Union and the United States. A true world war was now pretty much guaranteed. Next up, let's talk about the escalation. Because in the early years of the war, the Axis powers seemed absolutely unstoppable, but a few key events were about to change everything. In those first couple of years, Germany's military was a terrifying force. They used this new tactic called blitzkrieg, which literally means lightning war. It was all about speed and overwhelming power, hitting with planes and tanks all at once. And it worked. They rolled over Poland, Norway, Denmark, and even France with shocking speed. And the result of that blitzkrieg? By 1940, a massive chunk of Europe was under Nazi control. It really looked like the Axis powers were on their way to an unbeatable victory. For the Allies, especially Britain, standing nearly alone, things looked incredibly bleak. But then, on December 7th, 1941, something happened on the other side of the planet that changed the entire game. This was the moment the war went from being a mostly European fight to a true global inferno. Japan, a key Axis power, wanted to expand its empire in the Pacific. To do that, they felt they needed to knock out the American fleet, so they launched a devastating surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. That single act, that one morning, was all it took to pull a neutral United States right into the heart of the war, completely shifting the balance of power. The year 1943. This is what many call the great turning point of the war. After years of the Axis pushing forward, the tide finally and permanently began to turn against them. And a huge part of that turn was the Battle of Stalingrad. We're talking one of the longest, deadliest, most brutal battles in all of human history. The Soviet Union won a crushing victory. This wasn't just a military loss for Germany. It was a devastating psychological blow. From that moment on, the German army was basically in full retreat on the Eastern Front. And that brings us to the end game, the final phase of the war, the chapter that would see the total collapse of the Axis powers. The end of the war in Europe happened incredibly fast. By the spring of '45, the Allies were closing in from the west, while the massive Soviet army was storming Berlin from the east. Trapped with his capital in ruins, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. Just a few days after that, Germany surrendered. It was over. So, while people were celebrating in the streets of Europe, the war in the Pacific was still raging. Japan was fighting fiercely, and one last terrible chapter of World War II was about to be written. To force an end to the fighting and avoid what was expected to be a bloody and costly invasion of Japan, the United States made a decision that would change the world. They used a brand new, terrifying weapon, the atomic bomb. First on the city of Hiroshima, then on Nagasaki. The destruction was unlike anything ever seen before. A few weeks later, on September 2nd, 1945, Japan officially surrendered. World War II was finally over. So finally, let's talk about the echo, the legacy of the war, and the powerful lessons that came out of all that devastation. We started this explainer talking about the human cost, and it's so important we end there too.
The final death toll is estimated to be somewhere between 70 and 80 million people. It is, and remains, the deadliest conflict in human history. Period.
You know, out of all that chaos and destruction, the world tried to build something new. They came together and created the United Nations. Its whole mission was to maintain peace and security, to give countries a way to talk instead of fight, all with one main goal: to make sure a catastrophe like World War II could never, ever happen again. And that brings us to one last crucial question. The Second World War taught us some incredibly painful lessons about nationalism, about aggression, and about why it's so important for countries to work together. But when you look at the world today, you have to ask yourself, have we truly learned that lesson? That's a question for all of us to think about.